Welcome, my friend. Let everything slow. Long before the elves raised their first white towers, before the dwarfs sank their first mine shaft into the mountains, before men had learned to shape stone or fire, the Lizardmen of Lustria were already ancient. They are not a people who grew from the world in the ordinary way, but a race built with purpose by beings who came from somewhere else entirely, set upon a task so vast that their servants still labor at it today, ages after their makers vanished without explanation. Tonight we begin their story, with the old ones and the great and unfinished plan they left behind. Tonight we sit with the old ones and their great plan, the origin of the Lizardmen, and the design that still shapes their every act. Tonight we sit with the old ones and their great plan, the origin of the Lizardmen, and the design that still shapes their every act. The ones who came from the stars. Before the world held any race that could call itself its own, the old ones arrived from beyond it, bringing with them a purpose the Lizardmen still serve. In the deepest ages of the world, before any of the great races history remembers had taken their first steps, the old ones came. They were not native to the world, but travelers from somewhere far beyond it, beings of vast power and vaster patience, arriving with purposes of their own that the world's later inhabitants would only ever glimpse in fragments. Some among their most favoured servants are said to have journeyed alongside them across that great distance, present even before the world itself had been shaped to the old ones' liking. Whatever their true nature, the old ones came as builders and shapers, not as conquerors of a land already settled, but as architects arriving upon ground still raw and unformed. What drove the old ones to undertake their work in this world, the Lizardmen who serve their memory have never learned in whole. Some fragments suggest a war against a great and formless enemy, a foe whose corruption threatened to unmake reality itself, unless it could be contained. Whatever the full truth, the old ones set about remaking the world according to a design of their own, raising vast works of stone and magic, shaping the land, the seas, and the creatures already living upon it into forms suited to the plan they carried. Nothing in the world before them serves as a guide to what they intended, for reasons only they ever understood in full. Central to this design were great gates raised at the very poles of the world, structures of tremendous power meant to channel and contain the raw energy of a realm of chaos that pressed against the world from beyond it. Alongside these gates, the old ones wove a vast network of power across the land itself, linking sacred sites into a single web through which they could draw upon reserves of magic and work wonders no later race could hope to match. This network and these gates were the foundation of everything the old ones built, the scaffolding upon which their whole great plan was meant to rest. The scale of this undertaking is difficult to grasp even in outline. The old ones did not content themselves with a single fortress or a single realm. They reached across the whole of the world, raising sites of power on every continent, linking them together through the web of magic they wove beneath the land itself. Through this web, a working set in motion on one shore of the world might draw upon energy gathered on another entirely, the whole earth bound together into a single vast instrument for whatever purpose the old ones ultimately intended. No race that came after them, however mighty its sorcerers or however patient its builders, ever matched the sheer breadth of what the old ones achieved in their long labor. And there is a stranger thread woven through the little that survives of their coming, that the old ones themselves may have arrived not merely as travelers from distant places, but from beyond the ordinary bounds of the world's own sky, crossing a gulf no map of the Warhammer world could ever chart. What such a journey demanded of them, and what other worlds they may have shaped before ever they turned their attention to this one, remains entirely beyond the knowledge of the servants they left behind. The Lizardmen, who carry their memory forward, inherited a plan, not a history, and the deepest questions of who the Old Ones really were and where they came from have no answer that has ever reached the world they built. Lefesin. Servants grown for a purpose. To carry out their design across a whole world, the Old Ones did not settle it themselves, but shaped servant races suited to the work, each grown for a purpose, rather than born in any ordinary sense. The Old Ones understood that their design could not be carried out by their own hands alone, however great their individual power. A world remade according to so vast a plan required servants beyond counting, workers and warriors and stewards, spread across every corner of the land the Old Ones meant to shape. And so, in the steaming jungles that would come to be called Lustria, the Old Ones set about creating such servants, drawing upon creatures already living in that ancient wilderness and remaking them into forms suited to the work ahead. From this labor came the races the world would later know as the Lizardmen, each caste built for a distinct role within the whole. Some were made to labor, hauling stone and timber for the temples and monuments the great plan required. Some were made to oversee this labor, quick and clever enough to direct the work of others. Some were made to fight, given strength and ferocity enough to defend what the Old Ones built against any threat that might rise against it. And highest among them all, a caste was made to think and to plan, to hold within itself something of the Old Ones' own vast understanding, and to carry that understanding forward long after its makers had gone. This manner of creation set the Lizardmen apart from every race that would come after them, where the elves and dwarfs and later men would grow through birth and generation, learning their place in the world through the slow accumulation of choice and circumstance. The Lizardmen were made complete from the very first, each caste given its purpose before it ever drew its first breath. There was no childhood in which a Lizardman might have discovered some other calling, no chance encounter that might have turned a warrior toward scholarship or a laborer toward war. Purpose came first, and the individual came after, shaped entirely around the role the Old Ones had already determined it would serve. There is something worth dwelling on in what this manner of creation spared the Lizardmen, as much as in what it denied them. A race made in this fashion carries none of the doubt that so often troubles those who must discover their place in the world through trial and disappointment. A Saurus warrior does not wonder whether some gentler calling might have suited it better. A skink overseer does not chafe against the labor it directs, wishing instead for a warrior's glory. Each caste was shaped with such precision that the very questions which trouble races born rather than made scarcely arise among them at all. Their purpose settled before their existence even began. And yet, this same precision left the Lizardmen curiously unprepared for anything the Old Ones had not foreseen. A race shaped so thoroughly around a single design has little capacity to improvise when that design falters, little instinct for choosing a new path when the old one closes. The Lizardmen would come, in later ages, to face circumstances their makers had never accounted for, and in those moments, the very completeness of their original purpose would prove as much a burden as a gift, a people built for certainty finding themselves, at last, forced to reckon with its absence. A plan beyond full understanding. The design the Old Ones set in motion was called, by those who came to serve it, the Great Plan, a design so vast that even its most favored servants have never grasped the whole of it. At the heart of everything the Old Ones built lay a single overarching design, a plan that reached across the whole of the world and, by some accounts, beyond it, encompassing purposes so vast that no single mind among their servants could hold the whole of it at once. This was the great plan, the purpose for which the Old Ones had remade the world, shaped its creatures, and raised their great works of stone and magic. It touched everything they built, every race they made, every gate and web of power they wove across the land, all of it bent toward some final design whose full shape remained, even to the wisest of the Old One's servants, only ever partly known. To ensure their design could continue even without their constant guidance, the Old Ones left behind instructions inscribed upon sacred plaques and impressed straight into the minds of their most favored creations. These fragments carried pieces of the whole design, enough for a faithful servant to know what task lay immediately ahead, though rarely enough to grasp why that task mattered within the larger shape of the plan. A servant might know precisely where a temple must be raised, precisely when a certain ritual must be performed, without ever knowing what final purpose these acts were meant to serve. There is a particular kind of trust demanded by instructions given in this fashion, one that asks a servant to act without ever being shown the reasoning behind the act. Most who serve a plan larger than themselves are granted at least some sense of the whole, some account of how their small part fits into a larger purpose they can hold in mind, even imperfectly. The Old Ones offered their servants no such comfort. The plaques and impressions they left behind spoke only in commands, precise and absolute, silent on the question of why any particular command mattered at all. To serve the great plan is to act on faith alone, guided by instructions whose deeper logic was never meant to be shared. This silence was perhaps by design rather than oversight. A plan spanning ages beyond counting, touching purposes too vast for any single servant to hold in mind, may have had no way at all to explain itself in terms a finite mind could grasp, its true shape too large to compress into any instruction a servant could carry and still comprehend. Or perhaps the silence served some purpose of its own, ensuring that servants who might otherwise question or reshape their given tasks instead carried them out just as intended, undistracted by reasoning that might have led them astray. Either way, the result was the same. A race that has served its maker's design for ages beyond memory, understanding almost none of it, and trusting all of it regardless. This is the strange inheritance the Lizardmen carry to this day. Absolute certainty about what must be done, paired with only fragments of understanding as to why. They serve a plan whose author has long since vanished, following instructions laid down before the world had even finished taking its current shape, trusting that each act asked of them serves some purpose too vast for any single mind to encompass. It is a devotion built on faith in a design they trust without ever seeing it whole, rather than on comprehension of it, a faith that has carried the Lizardmen through every age since, long after the ones who set them their task were gone. There is a solemn beauty to this kind of devotion, one worth pausing over before the story moves any further. Most acts of faith in the world ask their followers to believe in something unseen but promised, a reward or redemption that lies somewhere ahead, if only the faithful hold to their course. The Lizardmen ask for no such promise. They serve the great plan because it is the purpose for which they were made, rather than because they expect some final reward for their labor. Its completion, the only end their whole existence was ever built to serve. Whether the plan will ever be finished, whether the Old Ones will ever return to judge how faithfully it was carried out, remains as unknown to the Lizardmen now as it was in the earliest age of their creation. And so, the Lizardmen carry a devotion that asks nothing in return, tending a design they did not choose, following instructions whose author has never once returned to check the work, generation after generation of servants raised to continue a task whose end no living creature has ever witnessed. It is a strange kind of loyalty to hold across so many ages, faith without confirmation, service without reward, purpose without the comfort of a purpose understood in whole. Few races in the whole of the world have ever been asked to sustain so much for so long, with so little assurance that any of it still matters to the ones who first demanded it. What became of the Old Ones, and the servant races they built to carry their design forward, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow we sit with the casts of the Great Plan, the Slann and the Skinks and the Saurus and the Croxigors, who serve it still. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with the casts of the Great Plan. The servant races the Old Ones shaped to carry their design forward. To carry out a design as vast as the one the Old Ones set in motion, no single kind of servant could ever have sufficed. And so the Old Ones shaped not one race but several, each caste built for a distinct portion of the great labour ahead, none of them born in any sense the world would later come to know, but grown, whole and purposeful, from pools of water and magic deep within the jungles of Lustria. Tonight we sit with the castes of the Great Plan. The servant races the Old Ones shaped to carry their design forward. Tonight we sit with the castes of the Great Plan. The servant races the Old Ones shaped to carry their design forward. The spawning pools. Deep within the temple cities of Lustria lie great pools where new lizardmen are grown rather than born, each shaped according to the position of the stars at the moment of its making. Where every other race of the world enters existence through birth, growing over years from infancy into whatever form its life will take, the Lizardmen come into being through an entirely different process. Within the deepest chambers of their temple cities lie great spawning pools, ancient basins tended by the Slann, where new Lizardmen are grown straight into the forms their purpose requires. A Saurus warrior does not grow into strength through years of training. It emerges from the pool already a warrior, its body and its instincts shaped from the very first moment of its existence to serve the role assigned to it. The manner in which each spawning unfolds is bound to something far beyond the pools themselves, the position of the stars above. The Slann, whose mastery of the Great Plan includes a deep understanding of the celestial patterns the Old Ones once used to time their works, oversee each spawning according to careful astrological calculation, timing the growth of new Lizardmen to align with configurations in the sky that only they can properly read. A spawning begun beneath one alignment of stars might yield warriors suited for a coming conflict. Another, beneath a different alignment, might yield the quieter servants needed for a season of building rather than war. This binds the whole of Lizardman society to the turning of the heavens in a way no other race shares, where the choices of other peoples are shaped by circumstance, by the decisions of kings or the pressures of war and famine. The choices of the Lizardmen are shaped, at their very root, by the patient movement of the stars above Lustria. The spawning pools do not create Lizardmen at random or according to the desires of the Slann who tend them. They respond to a celestial timing laid down by the Old Ones themselves, ensuring that each generation of servants arrives suited, as precisely as the stars allow, to whatever the Great Plan requires of that particular age. there is a strange freedom hidden within this rigid system, worth pausing on before the story moves further. A lizard man does not spend its existence wondering whether its life has meaning, does not lie awake questioning whether its labor serves any purpose beyond itself. For the very manner of its creation answers such questions before they could ever be asked. It emerged from the pool already fitted to a role the stars themselves had sanctioned, its place in the world settled by forces far older and far more patient than any individual doubt could ever challenge. What other races must spend a lifetime seeking, some sense of purpose and belonging, the lizardmen are given from the very moment of their making, with no seeking required. And yet this same system leaves the lizardmen almost entirely without the capacity for surprise about their own nature. A warrior spawned beneath the stars that favor war will be a warrior through the whole of its existence, with no expectation and little means of becoming anything else. Where other races might discover hidden talents or unexpected callings as their lives unfold, a lizardman's whole potential is fixed at the moment the pool releases it into the world, shaped in full by the stars above as much as by the will of the Slann, who oversaw its making. The Slann above all. At the summit of this careful design sit the Slann, toad-like sorcerer priests, who alone among the castes were made to understand the great plan, rather than only to serve it. Highest among all the castes the Old Ones shaped are the Slann, a race of squat toad-like beings whose appearance belies the immensity of what they carry within. Where the other castes were made for labor, for war, for the small and practical tasks that keep a civilization running, the Slann were made for something rarer, to hold within their minds fragments of the Old One's own understanding, to interpret the sacred plaques left behind, and to guide the whole of lizardmen society according to whatever portion of the great plan each of them was given to carry. The Slann treat their magic as a discipline of precise calculation, rather than mysterious art, an inheritance of the Old One's own fusion of sorcery and a kind of exacting, almost mechanical understanding that other races' wizards can barely comprehend. Where a sorcerer of another race might speak of intuition or inspiration, a Slann speaks, when it deigns to speak at all, of alignments and calculations, of workings that follow from the careful application of principles laid down long before the Slann themselves were spawned. Magic, to the Slann, is not a gift to be wielded freely, but a science to be practiced with the same exactness the Old Ones brought to every part of their design. Even among the Slann, not all were made equal in their closeness to the Old One's original purpose. The very first generation spawned dealt face to face with their makers, receiving instruction face to face in a manner no later generation would ever know. Each generation spawned after them inherited a portion of the great plan, suited to the age it was made to serve, the fullness of the Old One's original teaching growing more distant, generation by generation, as the Slann, who had known their makers firsthand, grew fewer, and their memory passed, ever more incompletely, to those who came after. Skinks, the clever hands. Beneath the Slann, but essential to nearly everything the lizardmen accomplish, serve the Skinks, quick and clever creatures who oversee labor, carry messages, and adapt to circumstance in ways the other castes cannot. Where the Slann were made to think and the Saurus to fight, the Skinks were made for the countless practical tasks that fall between these two extremes. Smaller and far more agile than their fellow castes, Skinks serve as the overseers of lizardmen labor, directing the vast efforts of construction and maintenance that keep the temple cities standing against the constant pressure of the jungle around them. They carry messages between distant settlements, tend the practical needs of Slann too absorbed in contemplation to attend to such matters themselves, and serve, in effect, as the hands and the voice of a civilization whose highest minds are often lost in calculations far removed from daily concerns. What sets the skinks apart from their fellow castes is a capacity for adaptation the others largely lack. A saurus, shaped so wholly for war, manages poorly when circumstances demand something other than combat. A croxigal, built for raw labour, has little instinct for subtlety of any kind. Skinks, by contrast, prove capable of turning their hand to whatever task the moment requires, riding swift flying beasts as scouts, operating the war engines mounted upon the great beasts of Lustria, or serving as priests when the Slann themselves grow too withdrawn to attend to the practical governance of their people. This flexibility makes them indispensable in ways the more singularly purposed castes could never manage. It is worth noting, too, that this same adaptability carries the skinks toward roles far beyond what their original purpose may have intended. In later ages, as the Slann grow ever more withdrawn into contemplation of the great plan, it falls more and more to the skink priests to hold the practical business of lizardmen's civilization together, tending temple cities, leading war parties, and preserving traditions the Slann themselves have grown too distant to oversee firsthand. The caste made for adaptability becomes, by necessity, the caste that adapts most of all. Stepping into a role of leadership its original purpose may never have anticipated in whole. There is an irony worth marking in this arrangement, one that touches on the whole design of the great plan itself. The old ones built the Slann to hold understanding, the skinks to hold flexibility, and yet the demands of a plan too vast for any single generation to complete seem to have shifted more and more of the actual governing weight onto the caste built for adaptability rather than the caste built for wisdom. It is as though the old ones, in shaping servants for a design that would stretch across ages beyond their own presence, could not help but build into that design the very flexibility that would one day be needed to keep it standing when their original plans for its governance proved insufficient to the ages that followed. This makes the skinks, in their own quiet way, the caste upon whom the whole continuity of lizardmen's civilization ultimately depends. Slann may grow distant, sinking so far into contemplation of the great plan that centuries pass between their moments of clear engagement with the world around them. Saurus and Croxigal, bound so tightly to single purposes, cannot fill the gap such distance leaves behind. It is the skinks, quick enough to notice what the Slann no longer attend to, and versatile enough to act upon it, who keep the temple city standing, the traditions preserved, and the great plan, however imperfectly understood, still being carried forward in the absence of clearer guidance from above. Saurus and Croxigal, bodies made for war and labour. Where the Slann were made to plan and the skinks to adapt, the Saurus and Croxigal were made for singular purposes, war and labour, each shaped with a directness that leaves little room for anything beyond its intended task. The Saurus form the great bulk of every lizardman army, warriors bred and spawned for a single purpose that leaves almost nothing to chance. Where a skink might turn its hand to a dozen different tasks across its life, a Saurus knows only the purpose it was grown to serve, obedient and ferocious in equal measure, following the commands of its Slann and skink superiors with an instinct that scarcely resembles choice at all. This is the Old One's design working as intended, rather than any failing of it. A warrior caste so thoroughly shaped for battle that hesitation, doubt, and independent ambition The very qualities that so often undermine the discipline of other races' armies have no place to take root at all. Beside the Saurus stand the Kroxigor, towering and immensely strong creatures made for the heaviest labor the Great Plan demands. Where a skink directs and a Saurus fights, a Kroxigor hauls the great stones of the temple cities, fells the trees the jungle would otherwise reclaim, and lends its raw strength to whatever task requires more than any other caste alone could manage. Less numerous and less common than the Saurus, the Kroxigor nonetheless serve an equally essential function: the sheer physical labor of sustaining a civilization as vast as the Lizardmen's, demanding a strength no other caste possesses in such abundance. Together, these two castes embody a principle that runs through the whole of the Old One's design. That purpose, made absolute and unwavering, produces a kind of efficiency no race shaped by ordinary birth and ordinary choice could ever match. A Saurus does not need to be convinced to fight, nor a Kroxigor persuaded to labor. Each was made already certain of its purpose, its whole existence a direct expression of the role the Great Plan assigned it. There is a cost to this certainty, though the Lizardmen themselves seem never to weigh it as a cost at all. A Saurus who falls in battle does not die mourning a life left incomplete, for it was never given the capacity to imagine a life beyond the one it was spawned to live. A Kroxigor crushed beneath falling stone does not perish. Regretting labor it might have refused, for refusal was never among the possibilities its nature allowed. What other races might call a tragedy, the Lizardmen's most singular castes meet with the same unwavering acceptance they bring to every other demand the Great Plan makes of them. Purpose and death alike absorbed into a design too vast to trouble itself with the fate of any single servant. What became of this vast and purposeful civilization once it was set loose upon the world, and the toad priests who ruled over it in their maker's name, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow we sit with the Slann Mage-Priests, the rulers of Lizardmen civilization, and the keepers of the Great Plan's deepest secrets. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with the Slann Mage-Priests, the rulers of Lizardmen civilization, and the keepers of the Great Plan's deepest secrets. Among all the castes the Old Ones shaped, none carries so great a weight as the Slann, the toad-like sorcerer priests, who alone were made to hold the Great Plan's deepest secrets. They do not walk among their people so much as float above them, born on ancient thrones that never touch the ground, treating the raw stuff of magic as a science of exact calculation, rather than any mystic art. Tonight we sit with the Slann Mage-Priests, the rulers of Lizardmen civilization, and the keepers of the Great Plan's deepest secrets. Tonight we sit with the Slann Mage-Priests, the rulers of Lizardmen civilization, and the keepers of the Great Plan's deepest secrets. The Toad Priests. Squat, corpulent and toad-like in form, the Slann bear little resemblance to the warriors and labourers who serve beneath them, their whole bearing marking them as something set apart from the ordinary business of the world. To look upon a Slann for the first time is to understand at once that this is no ordinary ruler. Where the Saurus stand tall and fierce, built for battle, and the skinks move quick and light, built for labour and errand, the Slann sit heavy and still, corpulent bodies more toad than lizard, seeming almost too large and too slow for any use beyond contemplation. And yet within this unhurried form rests power beyond anything the other castes could ever wield, a mind capable of calculations that would shatter lesser intellects, and a mastery of magic that borders on the absolute. Even the manner in which a Slann moves through the world marks it apart from every creature around it. Rather than walk, a Slann is borne upon a great floating throne, a stone seat suspended above the ground by ancient arcane energies that have sustained such thrones since ages beyond memory. This is no mere comfort granted to a ruler grown too heavy for its own legs. It is a fitting expression of the Slann's whole place within Lizardman society, never quite touching the ordinary ground the rest of its people walk upon, held always a careful distance above the world it governs, close enough to observe and to guide, yet never so close as to be mistaken for a part of the world in the way its subjects are. This physical remove mirrors something deeper in how the Slann approach their own power. Where a sorcerer of another race might speak of intuition, of some spark of inspiration that guides a working towards success, a Slann speaks of nothing of the kind. Magic, to a Slann, is a discipline as precise and unforgiving as any science, governed by calculations of such complexity that the warm-blooded races who came after the old ones, the elves and dwarfs and men, the Slann sometimes regard as newcomers to a world their own kind has served since its earliest shaping, can barely grasp even the outline of what such calculation requires. A Slann does not guess at a working's outcome. It calculates with a precision inherited whole from the old ones themselves, until the outcome is no longer in question at all. There is a coldness to this precision that the other races of the world often mistake for indifference, though the truth is stranger and less simple than mere disregard. A Slann does not withhold warmth from the world out of scorn for the creatures around it. Rather, its whole manner of engaging with reality has been shaped by a discipline that treats emotion as a kind of noise, a variable too unstable to be trusted within calculations that must hold true across centuries. What looks like distance from the outside is, from within, only the natural bearing of a mind trained to value certainty above sentiment, precision above the comforting uncertainties that guide lesser sorcerers. And yet, this coldness has its limits, however rarely they are glimpsed. Those few outsiders who have spent long enough among the Slann to earn something resembling their notice report a patience that borders on tenderness, a willingness to explain, however briefly, some fragment of the vast calculations underlying a working, as though even the most withdrawn of these ancient rulers retained some trace of whatever curiosity or care first moved the old ones to shape servants capable of thought at all. It is a small thing, easily missed beneath the weight of ceremony and distance that otherwise defines every encounter with a Slann, but it suggests that the toad priests are not so wholly removed from feeling as their bearing might first suggest. The 5 spawnings. Not all Slann were made alike. 5 distinct generations were spawned by the old ones, each carrying a different portion of the great plan, the first of them alone standing close enough to their makers to help raise the very gates that once held chaos at bay. The old ones did not spawn the Slann all at once, in a single act of creation meant to serve every age equally. Instead, they raised 5 distinct generations across the whole span of their design, each generation given a different role suited to the particular age it was meant to serve. This division reflects the same patience that marked everything the old ones built, rather than trust a single generation to carry the whole of so vast a plan across every era it would need to unfold. They spread the burden across 5 separate spawnings, each prepared for the specific tasks its own age would demand. Of these 5, the first spawning held a place unlike any that followed. These were the Slann, who worked most closely alongside the old ones themselves, present for instructions no later generation would ever receive firsthand. It was this first spawning who laboured to raise the great gates at the poles of the world, structures meant to hold the raw force of chaos in check, working alongside their makers in a partnership no Slann born after them would ever know. To be of the first spawning was to have stood, in some real sense, at the Old One's side during the very shaping of the design every later generation would spend its whole existence serving, without ever understanding in whole. This closeness came, in the end, at a terrible cost. When catastrophe struck the gates the first spawning had helped to raise, it was this same generation who bore the burden of holding back the ruin that followed, giving of themselves so utterly that half their number perished in the effort, their minds unable to withstand the raw touch of the very chaos they strove to contain. What became of this sacrifice and the ruin that made it necessary belongs to a darker chapter of the Lizardman story still to come. For now, it is enough to know that the generation closest to the Old Ones paid the highest price of any Slann who ever lived, their nearness to their makers purchased with a burden no later generation would ever be asked to bear in quite the same way. The generations that followed the first spawning inherited a diminished version of this closeness, each one further removed from the direct instruction their eldest kin had once received. A Slann of the second spawning might still recall, through whatever means the Slann passed their deepest knowledge onward, echoes of teachings the first had received firsthand. But these echoes could never carry the full weight of instruction given face to face by the makers themselves. By the time the fifth spawning was raised, only a few centuries before catastrophe struck, the living memory of the Old Ones had thinned into something closer to inherited tradition than direct experience. A reverence for makers few, if any, of that generation had ever encountered in any form beyond the plaques and impressions left behind. This gradual thinning of direct knowledge shapes much of what makes later Slann so different from the legendary first spawning, still spoken of in the deepest records of Lizardmen history, where the first spawning acted, in some sense, as junior partners to their makers, present for the shaping of the design itself. Every generation since has served as an interpreter of instructions rather than a participant in their creation. The Slann of later ages rule with all the authority their station demands, but they rule over a legacy they received second-hand, tending a plan whose original architects none of them ever had the chance to meet. The sacred plaques. Beyond the instructions impressed straight into their minds, the Slann keep and study physical relics of their maker's design, ancient plaques whose fragments guide the whole of the great plan even now. Not everything the Old Ones left behind for their servants took the form of instinct or impression. Scattered across the temple cities of Lustria, and in places far beyond them, lie sacred plaques, physical relics inscribed by the Old Ones themselves, each carrying some fragment of the great plan, set down in a form that could endure long after any single generation of Slann had passed. These plaques are treated with a reverence beyond nearly anything else in Lizardman civilization, studied and restudied across centuries by Slann, seeking to draw out every last fragment of guidance their makers thought to leave behind. The plaques do not offer their guidance easily. Ages of erosion, ages of upheaval, and the sheer alien complexity of the Old Ones' own manner of recording their designs mean that even the most devoted Slann may spend a lifetime studying a single plaque without ever unlocking in whole what it was meant to convey. Some plaques have been lost entirely, buried beneath collapsed temples, or carried away by disasters no record survives to explain. Others remain within reach, but resist interpretation, their meaning obscured by damage or by a manner of inscription too far removed from anything the Slann's own thought can readily pass. There is a particular anguish, rarely spoken of, but keenly felt among the Slann, in knowing that a plaque exists, that it has been recovered and set before them, and still finding its guidance beyond reach. A damaged plaque is not a closed door, but a door left maddeningly ajar, offering just enough of its meaning to suggest that some crucial instruction lies within, without offering enough to let that instruction be carried out with confidence. Some Slann are said to have devoted centuries to a single fragment of text, turning its meaning over and over across ages that would exhaust the patience of any other race, driven by the knowledge that somewhere within that stubborn inscription might lie guidance the whole of the great plan depends upon. And there is always the darker possibility that haunts this endless labor of interpretation, that some plaques, lost entirely to time and catastrophe, may have carried instructions no Slann will ever recover, portions of the great plan gone forever, leaving gaps in the design that no amount of study can ever fill. The Slann do not speak often of this possibility, but it shapes their work all the same, an unspoken awareness that their maker's full intention may already be, in places, permanently and irrecoverably incomplete, the great plan itself bearing wounds from ages long past that no devotion, however patient, will ever be able to heal. There is something worth holding on to in how the Slann respond to this uncertainty, rather than despair at it. Faced with gaps, their makers may never have intended to leave and can no longer help them fill. The Slann do not abandon the plan as broken beyond use. They continue as best they can, weighing what fragments remain against what little judgment their own long study has earned them, choosing to act on incomplete guidance rather than to let the whole of Lizardmen's civilization stall while waiting for a completeness that may never come. It is, in its own quiet way, a form of courage rarely credited to a race so often described only in terms of obedience and unwavering purpose, a courage built from the willingness to act well without certainty, rather than from certainty itself. And so, a great portion of what the Slann do, across the whole of their long and patient existence, is not the grand work of ruling armies or raising temples, but the quiet, unglamorous labor of interpretation, poring over fragments left by makers who never explain themselves in full, piecing together what guidance they can from plaques that answer only some of the questions their study raises. It is a task with no clear end, for new fragments occasionally surface even now, and old ones are occasionally lost. The whole slow work of understanding the great plan never quite complete, no matter how many ages the Slann devote to it. What became of the temple cities the Slann raised to house this endless work of interpretation, and the wonders these ancient rulers built above the jungles of Lustria, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, we sit with the temple cities of Lustria, the great works the Lizardmen raised in service of their maker's design. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we sit with the temple cities of Lustria, the great works the Lizardmen raised in service of their maker's design. Across the steaming jungles of Lustria rise the great temple cities of the Lizardmen, structures so vast and so precisely placed that no later race has ever matched their scale or their purpose. These were not settlements chosen at the convenience of those who built them, but sites dictated by the old ones themselves, each one a working part of a design that stretches across the whole of the world. Tonight we sit with the temple cities of Lustria, the great works the Lizardmen raised in service of their maker's design. Tonight we sit with the temple cities of Lustria, the great works the Lizardmen raised in service of their maker's design. Cities built to a precise design. The temple cities of Lustria do not stand where convenience or circumstance place them, but precisely where the old one's own instructions demanded, each site chosen for reasons the Lizardmen themselves were never told in whole. Where the cities of other races rise wherever a river bends favorably, or a hill offers good defense, the temple cities of the Lizardmen stand nowhere by accident. Every site, down to its precise location within the sprawling jungles of Lustria, was determined by instructions the Old Ones left for their Slann to follow. Instructions that specified not merely a general region, but an exact place, chosen for reasons bound up with the Great Plan in ways no lizard man has ever understood in whole. A temple raised even a short distance from its ordained site would fail to serve whatever purpose the Old Ones intended, however sound its construction or however skilled its builders. This precision extended to the architecture itself. Vast step structures raised high above the jungle canopy, built according to proportions and alignments that mirrored patterns found nowhere else in nature. Skinks directed the labor, overseeing the hauling of great stones by the powerful Croxigor, shaping monuments that would come to rise above the steaming green sprawl of Lustria, like mountains raised by hands, rather than by the slow work of the earth itself. Every temple, every pyramid, every great avenue between them followed a design laid down long before any living lizardman had drawn breath. A blueprint inherited rather than invented. Why the Old Ones demanded such exactness remains, like so much else about their design, only partly understood by those who carry it forward. Some among the Slann believe the precise placement of each city serves the geomantic web that binds the temple cities together, each structure a node in a vast network through which power flows between distant points of the world. Others believe the placement holds significance tied to the movement of the stars, each city positioned to catch some celestial alignment at a particular hour of a particular age. Whatever the true reason, the Lizardmen have never questioned the necessity of building precisely where they were told, trusting that the precision itself carried purpose even where the purpose remained unclear. There is a discipline in this trust that reveals something essential about the whole of Lizardmen civilization. Consider what it would mean for another race to labor for generations raising a structure whose exact location was dictated by instructions its builders could not explain in whole, trusting that the effort mattered without ever being shown why. Most races would sooner or later question such a demand, would ask whether the precision really served some purpose, or merely reflected the arbitrary preference of whoever first laid down the instruction. The Lizardmen have never raised this question in any form the records preserve, building just as instructed across ages beyond counting, their faith in the necessity of precision as absolute as their faith in every other part of the Great Plan. This same precision shapes how the Lizardmen think about failure and error, concepts that carry a weight among them unlike anything a more improvisational race would recognize. A temple built even slightly out of alignment with its ordained site is not merely imperfect. It is, in some sense, a betrayal of the whole design it was meant to serve, a flaw introduced into a pattern that depends upon exactness to function as intended. This is why the skinks who oversee construction work with such meticulous attention to measurement and placement, why even the smallest deviation from an ordained plan is treated with an urgency other races might reserve for far graver matters. In a civilization built entirely around precise instruction, precision itself becomes something close to sacred. Itza, the first city. The oldest of all the temple cities, Itza stands as the founding site of Lizardmen civilization, though the ages since its raising have seen its prominence eclipsed by younger and grander cities. Among all the temple cities scattered across Lustria, none claims a history older than Itza, the first city the Lizardmen ever raised, in service of the Great Plan. It was here that the earliest spawning pools were tended, Here that the first Slann began the long labour of interpreting the plaques their makers had left behind. Here that the whole vast civilization of the Lizardmen took its first uncertain steps. To speak of Itza is to speak of the beginning of everything that followed, the root from which every later temple city later grew. And yet age alone has not preserved Itza's place at the summit of Lizardman civilization. Across the long centuries since its founding, other cities have risen to eclipse it in splendor and in influence, their own Slann growing to a prominence Itza's ancient rulers no longer command in quite the same measure. This is not spoken of as any disgrace, for the Lizardmen do not measure worth the way other races might, weighing present glory against a city's foundational place in their history. Itza remains honoured precisely because it came first, its age itself a kind of standing that no younger city, however magnificent, could ever claim to share. There is something fitting in this quiet endurance, a city that no longer commands the greatest attention, and yet remains woven into the very identity of the civilization it began. Itza continues its work regardless of whether the eyes of the wider Lizardmen world turn toward it. Its Slann continuing the same patient labour of interpretation and maintenance that has occupied the city since its earliest days. To be first is not, among the Lizardmen, to be forgotten when others rise. It is only to have carried the weight of beginning, a weight every later city owes something to, whether or not that debt is often spoken aloud. There is a particular dignity worth marking in a civilization that treats its founding site this way, honouring precedents rather than measuring every city solely against present splendour. Other races so often forget or diminish the places where their history began, their capitals and centres of power shifting freely with the fortunes of whichever ruler or dynasty holds present sway. The Lizardmen, bound as they are to a design fixed long before any of them existed, seem incapable of this kind of forgetting. Itza's place in their history is as permanent as the stars that governed its founding. Its age a fact no shift in fortune among the younger cities could ever undo. Wakore, Hexoatl, the city of the sun. Where Itza holds the honour of age, Hexoatl holds the honour of present splendour, shining brighter than any other temple city and home to Lord Mazdamundi, the most active of all the surviving Slann. If Itza is the root of Lizardman civilization, Hexoatl is its brightest flowering, a city whose golden splendour has earned it the title City of the Sun, among those who have glimpsed its towers rising above the Lustrian jungle. Where other temple cities have fallen into quiet decline or outright ruin across the long ages since the old one's departure, Hexoatl has continued to grow and to shine, its structures maintained and expanded with a vigour few other sites can match. It stands today as the clearest surviving expression of what the temple cities were once meant to be at the height of their maker's design. Much of this continued vigour owes itself to Lord Mazdamundi, the Slann who rules Hexoatl and who stands, by most accounts, as the most active and most engaged of all the Slann who still tend the great plan. Where many of his kin have withdrawn so far into contemplation that centuries may pass with little visible guidance from them, Mazdamundi remains a present and forceful ruler, directing the defence and the growth of his city with an urgency that sets him apart from the more distant bearings so often associated with his caste. His continued engagement has helped Hexoatl avoid the slow drift into ritual and decline that has claimed so many other temple cities across the ages. There is a lesson worth drawing from the contrast between Hexoatl's brightness and the quiet endurance of older cities like Itza. The Slann were shaped, as a caste, for contemplation and calculation, and most drift, sooner or later, toward the withdrawn distance that marks their kind. Mazdamundi's continued vigour is, in this sense, something of an exception among his own people. A Slann who has resisted the pull toward pure contemplation and remained, across ages that have claimed the active engagement of so many of his kin, a ruler still present enough to shape the fate of the city he governs. Whether this makes him unusually devoted to the practical business of rule, or only unusually slow to succumb to the drift that claims his kind, is a question even the lizardmen themselves have never settled. The web that binds the cities together. No temple city stands alone. Each is bound to every other through the geomantic web, a vast network of magical power that links the whole of Lustria into a single working instrument of the great plan. Beneath the visible splendor of stone and gold that marks each temple city, runs something far less visible, but no less essential. The geomantic web, the vast network of magical power the Old Ones wove beneath the land itself, linking every temple city to every other across the whole of Lustria, and by some accounts, reaching further still to distant corners of the world. Through this web, power gathered at one site can be drawn upon at another. Workings begun in one temple city can draw strength from reserves held in cities the caster will never see. The whole of Lustria bound into a single vast instrument, no single city could ever hope to be on its own. This web explains, in part, why the precise placement of each temple city mattered so profoundly to the Old One's original design. A city built even slightly out of alignment with the web's underlying pattern would draw power poorly or disrupt the flow meant to reach other sites entirely. The whole vast network only as strong as the precision with which each of its individual nodes was placed. The Slann who maintain their cities today understand this interdependence keenly, for damage to the web at one temple city can ripple outward to weaken workings at cities that may lie a great distance away. The fates of distant Slann bound together by a network few outside their own caste ever perceive in whole. And so, the temple cities of Lustria, however separate they may appear to any traveller passing between them, form in truth a single body, each city a limb or an organ within a whole that only makes complete sense when considered together. Itza's age, Hexoatl's brightness, and the countless other cities scattered across the jungle each serve some part of a design that spans the whole of Lustria and beyond, bound together beneath the ground by a web the Old Ones wove before any of their servants had drawn their first breath. There is a vulnerability hidden within this same interconnection, one that would not trouble a collection of separate and unrelated settlements in the same way. A city that stood entirely alone might suffer its own misfortune without dragging its neighbours down alongside it, its ruin a contained tragedy rather than a wound felt across the whole network. The temple cities of Lustria enjoy no such isolation. Bound together as they are through the geomantic web, a catastrophe severe enough to damage one city's connection to the whole can send tremors of weakness rippling outward to cities that may lie an ocean's breadth away. The strength that flows between them, a source of power in ordinary times, and a channel for disaster in the worst of them. This interdependence would, in time, prove to be both the temple city's greatest strength and the very thing that let a single catastrophe threaten the whole of Lizardmen's civilization at once. A design built for efficiency, for the sharing of power across vast distances, carries within it the same vulnerability that marks any system built on deep connection. That a wound struck at one point need not remain contained there, but may travel through the very channels meant to strengthen the whole. to weaken every part the network touches. What became of this vast and interconnected civilization when catastrophe struck at last the very gates their makers had built to hold chaos at bay, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, we sit with the Great Catastrophe, the collapse that tore the world apart and left the old ones nowhere to be found. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we sit with the Great Catastrophe, the collapse that tore the world apart and left the old ones nowhere to be found. Every design, however patient, however vast, carries within it the possibility of failure, and even the old one's great work was not immune to ruin. At the poles of the world, the gates raised to hold back the raw force of chaos gave way at last, and in that single moment, the makers of the Lizardmen vanished from the world they had shaped, leaving their most devoted servants to face the ruin alone. Tonight we sit with the Great Catastrophe, the collapse that tore the world apart and left the old ones nowhere to be found. Tonight we sit with the Great Catastrophe, the collapse that tore the world apart and left the old ones nowhere to be found. The gates that could not hold. At the poles of the world stood the great gates the old ones had raised to contain the raw force of chaos, structures meant to endure beyond any single age, until the day they failed entirely. Recall the great gates the old ones raised at the poles of the world, structures built with the aid of the first spawning of the Slann, meant to channel and contain the raw and formless power of a realm that pressed against the ordinary world from somewhere beyond it. For ages beyond counting, these gates held, doing precisely what their makers had intended, keeping the world safe from a force that would otherwise have consumed it entirely. They stood as one of the old one's greatest achievements, a testament to the scale of what could be accomplished when their power and their patience were turned toward a single, sustained purpose. And then, in a single catastrophic moment that no surviving record explains in whole, the gates gave way. Whatever held them fast for so many ages proved insufficient at last. Whether through some flaw in their original design, some strain too great for even the old one's craft to withstand indefinitely, or some deliberate act by a force determined to see them broken. The Lizardmen, who served the Great Plan to this day, have never recovered a clear account of why the gates failed when they did, only that they did fail, and that the failure came without the warning that might have let anyone prepare for what followed. The collapse released in an instant the raw and formless power the gates had held in check for ages, a tide of energy that swept outward across the whole of the world with a force nothing built by mortal or near-mortal hands could hope to resist. Where the gates had once stood as a careful and patient work of containment, there now gaped a wound in the very fabric of reality, a rent through which the power of a realm never meant to touch the ordinary world came pouring through, unrestrained, into a world utterly unprepared for its arrival. The scale of what broke that day is difficult to hold in mind alongside the calm and patient civilization the old ones had spent so many ages building. Every temple raised according to precise instruction, every spawning timed to the careful movement of the stars, every fragment of the Great Plan interpreted with such painstaking devotion, all of it had unfolded within a world the gates had kept safe from the very force that now came flooding through the breach. The collapse did not merely damage some distant corner of the world, it threatened to undo the very stability that had let the whole of the old one's design proceed in the first place, a foundation assumed so totally that its failure left nothing beneath the Lizardmen's feet but uncertainty. There is a particular horror in a catastrophe that strikes at the very thing meant to prevent catastrophe. The gates existed for precisely this purpose, to ensure that the raw power now sweeping the world would never reach it at all. Their failure was more than one disaster among the many a civilization might face across its history. It was the failure of the one safeguard the whole of Lizardmen existence had been built to trust without question. The single point upon which the Old Ones had staked the safety of everything else they had made. The vanishing. In the very moment the gates collapsed, the Old Ones themselves disappeared from the world, their fate unknown to any of the servants they left behind. As the gates gave way, something else happened alongside the catastrophe, something the Lizardmen have never been able to explain in all the ages since. The Old Ones vanished. Whether they were consumed in the collapse itself, drawn away to face some crisis in whatever distant place they had come from, or lost in some manner the surviving records never captured at all, no one who served them was ever able to say. One moment, the Old Ones were present, however distantly, guiding the design their servants carried forward. In the next, they were gone, and no Lizardman has ever encountered them again in all the ages since. This vanishing compounds the tragedy of the gate's collapse in a way that mere destruction alone could never have managed. Had the Old Ones remained, even amid the ruin the broken gates unleashed, their guidance might have steadied a world thrown into chaos, their presence a reassurance that whatever went wrong could, in time, be set right by the very beings who had shaped the design in the first place. Instead, the Lizardmen found themselves facing a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, with no one left to explain what had happened, no one to direct the response, no one to confirm whether the great plan itself could survive so total a rupture in the world it was meant to shape. There is a particular cruelty in the timing of this abandonment, whether or not the Old Ones intended it as such. A servant left without guidance in ordinary times can at least hold to the last instructions received, trusting that circumstance has not yet outrun what those instructions anticipated. A servant left without guidance in the very moment of the worst catastrophe its maker's design has ever faced has no such comfort. The Lizardmen were asked, in effect, to face the single greatest crisis of their whole existence at the exact moment their maker's wisdom would have mattered most, and found that wisdom entirely absent, gone in the same instant the crisis began. Some among the Slann have wondered, across the long ages since, whether the Old One's departure was itself a kind of message, a final and terrible instruction, delivered through absence alone, rather than through plaque or impression. That the Lizardmen were meant, from this point forward, to face the great plans unfolding without the constant guidance they had known before. If so, it was a lesson taught at the highest possible cost, a civilization thrown into independence through sudden and total abandonment, rather than through any gradual weaning, forced to learn self-reliance in the very moment self-reliance seemed least survivable. This reading offers a kind of grim comfort, though whether it reflects anything the Old Ones really intended remains as unknowable as everything else about their disappearance. It suggests that the vanishing, terrible as it was, might yet serve some purpose within the larger design, a final test built into the great plan itself, rather than a simple abandonment born of circumstance beyond anyone's control. But it is worth remembering that this reading is a comfort the Slann have constructed for themselves, not a certainty handed down by their makers. The plaques are silent on the question. The Old Ones offered no farewell, no explanation, no promise of eventual return. Whatever meaning the Lizardmen have found in their maker's absence, they have had to build it themselves, out of the same faith that has carried them through every other uncertainty the great plan has ever demanded they endure. What remained, once the gates had broken and the makers had vanished and the first spawning had paid its terrible price, was a wounded world and a people who had never once been asked to face a crisis without their maker's guiding hand. The great plan itself still stood, its instructions still waiting in plaque and impression for those who would carry them forward. But it now belonged, for the first time since its conception, to servants alone, ordinary and imperfect as those servants were, left to interpret and to act without the certainty of a maker's presence standing somewhere behind their every decision. The timing of the disappearance, coinciding so precisely with the moment of the gate's failure, has led generations of Slann to wonder whether the two events were bound together by some connection deeper than simple coincidence. Perhaps the Old One's presence in the world depended, in some fashion the Lizardmen have never grasped, upon the very gates that failed. Perhaps their disappearance was itself the cause of the collapse, some crisis elsewhere drawing them away at the precise moment their continued presence was needed most. The Slann have turned this question over for ages beyond counting, and no plaque, no fragment of surviving instruction, has ever offered an answer they could trust as certain. The sacrifice of the first spawning. Left to face the ruin alone, the first spawning of the Slann gave everything they had to hold back a disaster their maker's departure had left them to face without guidance. With the Old Ones gone and the gates broken beyond any hope of simple repair, it fell to the first spawning of the Slann, the very generation who had helped raise the gates in the first place, to answer a catastrophe none of them had ever been prepared to face alone. These were the Slann who had known their makers most closely, who had laboured at their side during the gate's original construction, and now they alone possessed anything resembling the knowledge needed to attempt a response to the disaster consuming the world around them. What the first spawning attempted was not a repair in any ordinary sense, for the damage done to the gates lay far beyond what any working, however powerful, could hope to mend outright. Instead, they laboured to seal what portion of the breach they could, throwing the whole of their considerable power against a wound too vast for any single effort to close in whole. This labour exacted a terrible price. Half of the first spawning perished in the attempt, their minds unable to withstand direct exposure to the raw and formless power pouring through the breach, undone by contact with a force the gates had been built to keep them from ever having to face at all. And even this terrible sacrifice brought only a partial victory. The first spawning could shrink the breach, could slow the tide of raw power flooding into the world, but they could not close the wound entirely, nor could they halt the surge of energy that had already begun to spread outward across the whole of the world before their working took hold. What they achieved was mitigation rather than salvation, a catastrophe made survivable rather than a catastrophe undone, purchased with the minds and the lives of the very generation who had once stood closest to the makers, now nowhere to be found. There is a bitter symmetry worth marking in what the first spawning gave. These were the same Slann who had laboured alongside the Old Ones to raise the gates in the first place, present for their construction in a way no later generation would ever be. Now that same closeness, that same intimate knowledge of the gate's original design, was what allowed them to attempt a response at all, and what condemned so many of them to ruin in the attempt. The very gift that had once set the first spawning apart, their nearness to their maker's original work, became the burden that broke them when that work failed at last. Those among the first spawning who survived the working carried the marks of what they had faced for the whole of their remaining existence, their minds touched by an exposure to raw chaos that no Slann before or after them had ever endured so closely and lived. They became, in the ages that followed, among the most revered and most sorrowful figures in all of Lizardman history, survivors of a sacrifice too costly to be called victory and too consequential to be called anything less than heroism, bearing witness to a catastrophe few others could claim to have faced so closely and return from at all. The wound the first spawning could not close in whole left its mark upon the world itself, not only upon the minds of those who fought to seal it. Across the lands nearest the broken gates, the very fabric of reality remained thin and unsettled for ages afterward, a lingering fragility that would draw the attention of every dark power seeking a way back into the world. What had been, before the collapse, a boundary as solid and as trustworthy as the mountains themselves became, in the wake of the catastrophe, a scar that never entirely healed, a standing invitation to whatever forces still pressed against the world from beyond it. What became of the Lizardmen in the ruin that followed, and the desperate war they were forced to wage against the horrors the broken gates unleashed, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow we sit with the war against chaos, the desperate defense the Lizardmen mounted when the Old One's great work failed at last. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with the war against chaos, the desperate defense the Lizardmen mounted when the Old One's great work failed at last. The breach the first spawning could not seal in whole became the door through which the true horror of the catastrophe came pouring into the world. Legions of demons spawned from the raw power now flooding across the land, falling upon the temple cities of Lustria in numbers the Lizardmen had never before been asked to face. What followed was a war longer and more terrible than anything the Great Plan had prepared its servants to endure, a struggle that would claim the last of the first spawning and test whether the Lizardmen could survive at all without their makers to guide them. Tonight, we sit with the war against chaos, the desperate defense the Lizardmen mounted when the Old One's great work failed at last. Tonight we sit with the war against chaos, the desperate defense the Lizardmen mounted when the Old One's great work failed at last. The tide of demons. Through the wound the gates had left behind, legions of demons poured into the world, falling upon Lustria in numbers the Lizardmen had never before been forced to withstand. The raw power released by the collapse of the gates did not dissipate harmlessly across the world. It gave rise, in the ruined lands nearest the breach, and in places far beyond, to demons, creatures given form and hunger by the very chaos the gates had once held safely at bay. These were not ordinary foes to be met on any battlefield the Lizardmen had prepared for. They came in numbers beyond counting, driven by an appetite for destruction that knew no negotiation and no retreat, sweeping toward the temple cities of Lustria with a fury the careful, patient civilization of the Slann had never been built to withstand. Lustria, the heartland the Old Ones had shaped as the center of their whole design, found itself under siege from every direction at once. Temple cities that had stood for ages beyond memory, their spawning pools tended and their plaques studied in unbroken patience since the earliest days of the Great Plan, now faced armies of demons hurling themselves against walls raised for a very different kind of world, one in which the gates still held and such horrors remained safely beyond reach. The Lizardmen, a people shaped for the slow and patient work of building rather than the desperate business of survival, found themselves fighting not for the completion of their maker's design, but for the very continuation of their existence. This was, in every sense, a war the Great Plan had never anticipated. No plaque spoke of demon legions descending upon Lustria, No fragment of instruction prepared the Slann for a conflict in which the very survival of their civilization, rather than its steady progress towards some distant and half-understood purpose, hung in the balance. The Lizardmen were forced, for the first time since their creation, to improvise a response to a crisis their makers had never foreseen, drawing upon whatever strength and cunning each caste possessed to meet a horror the great plan offered no guidance for facing. The fall of Zahutek. Among all the temple cities besieged by the demon tide, Zahutek fell first, its mage-priests slain and its spawning pools corrupted beyond any hope of swift restoration. Of the many temple cities that stood against the demon tide, none fell so swiftly or so utterly as Zahutek. Whether its position placed it nearer the worst of the breach, or whether some other misfortune left it less prepared than its sister cities, Zahutek became the first of the great works of Lizardmen civilization to be overwhelmed entirely, its walls breached, its defenders slaughtered, its Slann Mage-Priests slain before they could mount whatever defense their power might otherwise have offered. Where Zahutek had once stood as a testament to the Old One's design, it became instead the first proof of how vulnerable that design really was once the gates that sheltered it had failed. The loss went beyond the deaths of those who defended the city. The spawning pools at the heart of Zahutek, the very wellspring from which new Lizardmen had been grown according to the careful calculations of the Slann for ages beyond counting, were corrupted by the touch of the demon horde that overran them. What had been a source of new life, timed to the patient movement of the stars and shaped according to the Old One's own design, became instead a wound in the very machinery of Lizardmen civilization, a spawning ground no longer safe to trust, its future generations uncertain in a way no temple city had ever faced before. The fall of Zahutek sent a shock through the whole of Lizardmen civilization that no later victory could undo in whole. It proved, in the starkest terms possible, that the temple cities were not invulnerable, that the great plan's patient unfolding could be halted, not merely delayed by circumstance beyond anyone's control. Every city that still stood now knew, with a certainty no plaque had ever needed to confirm, that it too could fall, that the demon tide sweeping Lustria recognized no city as too ancient or too sacred to be overwhelmed in turn. There is something worth marking in how a civilization built so entirely around certainty responded to a loss that defied every assumption its whole design had rested upon. The Slann, who survived Zahutek's fall, did not abandon the great plan in despair, did not conclude that their maker's design had failed merely because one part of it had been overwhelmed by a horror no plaque had warned them of. Instead, they carried the lesson forward into the defense of every city that remained, a grim new certainty added to the store of knowledge each generation would inherit, that vigilance, once assumed to be a matter of patient routine, must now be treated as a matter of survival, that the peace the temple cities had known before the catastrophe could no longer be taken for granted in any city, however ancient or however far from the breach it happened to stand. And there is a particular sorrow in what became of Zahutek's ruins in the ages that followed. A city that had once stood as one of the great works of the Old One's design became, after its fall, a haunted and broken place, its corrupted spawning pools left to fester rather than restored, its fallen mage-priests remembered, but never replaced in the same numbers the city had once known. Zahutek stands even now as a reminder scattered among the jungles of Lustria that the great plan's patient unfolding was never wholly guaranteed against catastrophe, a wound the Lizardmen carry alongside every other memory of the war that nearly ended them. the Long War. For centuries beyond counting, the Lizardmen fought to hold back the demon tide, a war that claimed the last of the firstborning and tested the whole of their civilization's capacity to endure. What followed the fall of Zaotek was not a swift campaign, but a grinding war that stretched across centuries, the Lizardmen assembling armies greater than any their history had known. Saurus and Kroxigor and Skink alike, thrown into a struggle that showed no sign of ending. Every caste the Old Ones had shaped for their own particular purpose now found that purpose bent entirely toward survival. Warriors and laborers and overseers alike absorbed into a war effort that consumed generation after generation, with little pause for the slower work the Great Plan had once demanded of them. The cost of this long war fell heaviest upon the very generation who had already given so much to seal the broken gates. The firstborning, diminished already by half in their earlier sacrifice, spent what remained of their strength across the centuries of war that followed, their numbers dwindling further with every temple city they helped defend, every demon incursion they helped turn back. Within roughly 3 centuries of the catastrophe's beginning, the last of the firstborning had fallen. The generation who alone had known the Old Ones first-hand gone from the world entirely, their passing marking the final severing of any living connection between the Lizardmen and the Makers who had shaped them. This loss changed something essential about Lizardmen civilization, though the change unfolded slowly enough that its full weight may not have been felt until long after the war itself had ended. Every Slann now living belonged to a generation that had never known the Old Ones at all, inheriting the Great Plan through plaque and impression alone, without even the second-hand comfort of elders who could recall, however faintly, what it had once meant to labor alongside their makers. The war against chaos had cost the Lizardmen more than cities and lives. It had cost them the last living thread connecting them to the beings whose design they still served. There is a particular weight to being the generation that inherits a loss it did not itself witness, tasked with carrying forward a reverence for makers none of the living have ever known, and none of the living can any longer consult, even through the diminished channel of an elder's fading memory. The Slann who emerged from the long war against chaos found themselves custodians of a devotion built entirely on faith, rather than any remaining thread of direct experience, the last living witnesses to the Old Ones now as thoroughly gone from the world as the Makers themselves. What had begun in the earliest ages as service performed alongside living guidance had become, by the war's end, service performed entirely in memory of an absence, a devotion owed to beings no living Slann could any longer claim to have really known. The vortex that ended the war. It was a working performed far away by a people the Lizardmen had never sought as allies that broke the demon tide at last, rather than the Lizardmen's own centuries of warfare, the creation of the Great Vortex. For all the courage and sacrifice the Lizardmen poured into their long war against the demon tide, it was not their own strength that brought the conflict to an end at last. Far across the world, a rising people the Lizardmen had never courted as allies, the elves who would come to be known for their mastery of magic and their ancient island home, undertook a working of tremendous scale, a great ritual meant to draw away the raw and excess power still flooding the world from the broken gates, gathering it into a single vast and controlled vortex, rather than letting it continue to feed the demon legions that fed upon it. This working succeeded, where centuries of Lizardman warfare alone had not been able to succeed outright. As the vortex drew the raw power of chaos away from the world's surface, The demon legions that had fed upon that power for so long found themselves banished, driven back into the realm from which they had come. The tide that had overwhelmed Zautek and threatened every other temple city beginning, at last, to recede. The war the Lizardmen had fought and bled for so long did not end through any final victory of their own making, but through the intervention of a working conceived and completed by another people entirely. There is a difficult truth in this for a civilization built so entirely around its own devotion to a design inherited from its makers. The Lizardmen had fought with everything the Great Plan had shaped them to offer, had lost their oldest generation and their greatest cities in the effort, and still the final resolution came from elsewhere. From a working they had no hand in shaping, and little warning of before it took effect. And yet this truth, difficult as it was, did not sour into resentment among the Slann, who lived to see the war's end. Rather than begrudge a people who had succeeded where their own long war had fallen short, the Slann came to regard the elves' vortex with something closer to quiet respect, an acknowledgement that the Great Plan's continuation sometimes depended on forces and workings beyond the Lizardmen's own making, and that pride in their maker's design need not blind them to the value of what others could accomplish. This willingness to accept help from outside the Great Plan's own instruction, however grudgingly it may have first been offered, marks one of the few moments in Lizardmen history where the rigid certainty of their purpose bent, if only slightly, to accommodate a truth their makers had never plainly written down for them. There is something worth carrying forward from this moment of humbling, one that would come to shape the whole of the ages that followed the war. A civilization shaped so wholly by inherited certainty, so thoroughly built around instructions given rather than lessons learned through circumstance, discovered in the crucible of this long and terrible war a form of wisdom the Plaques had never thought to teach, that even the most devoted service to a design beyond one's own understanding must sometimes make room for the unexpected, for aid that arrives unbidden, for a resolution shaped by hands the Great Plan never anticipated needing at all. What this meant for how the Lizardmen understood their own place in the world, and the quiet vigilance they would come to keep over a vortex built by hands not their own, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, we sit with the Age of Isolation, the long withdrawal that followed the war and reshaped Lizardmen's civilization for every age that followed. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we sit with the Age of Isolation, the long withdrawal that followed the war and reshaped Lizardmen's civilization for every age that followed. With the demon tide banished and the last of the first spawning gone from the world, the Lizardmen entered an age unlike any they had known before, a long and quiet withdrawal in which the Slann sank ever deeper into contemplation. The practical business of their civilization fell more and more to skink priests who had never been made to bear such weight, and the whole shape of Lizardmen society began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to change. Tonight we sit with the Age of Isolation, the long withdrawal that followed the war and reshaped Lizardmen's civilization for every age that followed. Tonight we sit with the Age of Isolation, the long withdrawal that followed the war and reshaped Lizardmen's civilization for every age that followed. The long withdrawal. In the aftermath of the war, the Slann sank ever deeper into contemplation, their guidance growing rarer and more distant with every passing age. The war against chaos left the Lizardmen victorious, but hollowed, their greatest cities scarred, their oldest generation gone, their once thriving civilization reduced to a shadow of what it had been before the gates first broke. In this ruin, the Slann who remained turned inward, sinking into a depth of contemplation that would come to define the whole of the age that followed. Where once a Slann might have engaged first-hand with the practical governance of its city, guiding its skinks and saurus through the ordinary business of building and defending, the Slann of this new age withdrew further and further from such matters, absorbed instead in a stillness that could stretch across decades, even centuries, with little visible engagement from those who governed. Several forces conspired to draw the Slann toward this withdrawal. The geomantic web that had once bound the temple cities together in a single working instrument now lay damaged in many places, its currents disrupted by the war and by the catastrophe that had preceded it, demanding careful and patient attention from those Slann capable of tending it. The loss of the first spawning had stripped away the last living connection to the old ones themselves, leaving every remaining Slann to work from plaques and impressions alone, a labour of interpretation that demanded the kind of prolonged, uninterrupted focus few practical matters could accommodate. And the sheer weight of what the war had cost, the ruined cities, the corrupted spawning pools, the generation lost to chaos and to the long fight against it, seemed to press the surviving Slann toward a depth of reflection none of their kind had needed before the catastrophe struck. Whatever the precise cause, the effect was unmistakable across every temple city that survived the war. A Slann, who might once have spoken with its skinks daily, now might fall silent for years at a stretch, its attention turned entirely inward, its body motionless upon its floating throne, while its mind laboured over calculations and considerations no outsider could ever hope to follow. This was not decline in the sense of failing power, for the Slann remained, even in this withdrawn state, among the most formidable sorcerers the world had ever known. It was something else, a civilization whose highest minds had turned so far inward that the ordinary business of ruling had to find some other hand to carry it forward. There is a question worth holding gently here, one the Lizardmen themselves rarely seem to ask aloud, whether this withdrawal represents a kind of grief the Slann have never found another way to express. A people so thoroughly shaped for certainty and calculation may have little vocabulary, even within their own minds, for processing loss on the scale the war had inflicted, the fall of Zautek, the death of the entire first spawning, the corruption of spawning pools that had served the great plans since the earliest ages, where another race might mourn openly, might speak of its dead and its ruined cities in words the living could share and carry forward together. The Slann may have found, in the depths of silent contemplation, the only outlet their nature permitted for a sorrow too vast to voice in any other form. Whether this reading holds any truth, the Lizardmen themselves have never confirmed it, for the withdrawn Slann rarely explain the nature of their contemplation to those who serve beneath them. What is certain is only the shape the withdrawal took. Cities governed in name by rulers who grew ever harder to reach. A civilization that had once moved with the confident precision of a design understood in whole now proceeding, generation after generation, under the guidance of minds too deep in their own reflection to offer the clear direction earlier ages had known. The Mage-Priests take up the burden. As the Slann withdrew ever further, it fell to the Mage-Priests to hold the practical business of Lizardmen civilization together, a burden that slowly reshaped their whole caste. Into the gap the Slann's withdrawal left behind stepped the Mage-Priests, the same adaptable caste whose flexibility had always let them turn their hand to whatever task circumstance demanded. where once they had served as messengers and overseers, directing labour and carrying instruction between more powerful castes. The skink priests now found themselves governing entire temple cities in all but name, restoring what the war had broken, tending what the withdrawn Slann no longer attended to firsthand, preserving traditions whose deepest meaning grew hazier with every generation that inherited them second-hand. This shift did not happen through any deliberate transfer of authority, for the Slann never formally relinquished their place at the summit of Lizardman society. Rather, the skink priests filled whatever space the Slann's withdrawal left open, their practical competence expanding to meet whatever the moment required, until the day-to-day governance of nearly every temple city rested in their hands, even as ultimate authority remained, in principle, with Slann, who might not speak or act for years at a time. It was a quiet and unannounced transformation, one that reshaped the whole structure of Lizardmen's civilization without ever being declared as policy by anyone empowered to declare such things. And this new burden changed the skink priests in turn, drawing them towards something closer to ritualism than the flexible, adaptive service that had once defined their caste. Tasked with preserving traditions and ceremonies whose original purpose the withdrawn Slann could no longer easily explain, the skink priests more and more performed the forms of the great plan's rites without the deeper comprehension that had once accompanied them, echoing patterns handed down rather than reasoning through their original intent. This was not failure so much as necessity, a caste built for adaptation, finding that the task now demanded of it was less about understanding than about faithful, careful repetition, keeping the shape of the old one's design intact, even as the reasons behind that shape grew ever more distant. Guardians in secret. Even in their withdrawal, the Slann did not abandon the wider world entirely, tending in secret to a working built by hands not their own. The vortex the elves had raised to end the demon war. Amid all this inward turning, one act of outward attention endured, quiet and unacknowledged by the very people it served. The Slann, despite their deepening withdrawal from the practical governance of their own cities, continued to lend their considerable power to the maintenance of the elves' great vortex, the working that had banished the demon tide at last, when the Lizardmen's own long war could not. This support was given freely and without any expectation of recognition, the Slann labouring across the geomantic web to help sustain a working raised by a people who, by most accounts, never learned of the aid being extended to them from across the world. There is a particular grace in this quiet stewardship, one that stands apart from nearly everything else that marked the age of isolation. Even as the Slann withdrew from their own people's daily concerns, they continued to reach outward toward a purpose that served the whole world, rather than the Lizardmen alone, tending a vortex not of their own making, because its continued function mattered to the stability of everything the great plan still depended upon. It was a devotion offered in secret, asking nothing of the elves who benefited from it, and receiving nothing beyond the quiet satisfaction of a task faithfully continued. This secret guardianship reveals something essential about what remained constant, even as so much else about Lizardman civilization began to shift and change. The Slann, who could no longer be troubled to guide their own skinks through the ordinary business of a single day, could still find, somewhere within their withdrawn contemplation, the will to labour on behalf of a working raised by strangers on the far side of the world, a devotion to the wider stability of the great plan that outlasted even their engagement with the more immediate concerns of the cities they nominally ruled. There is a lesson worth marking in this contrast, between what the Slann neglected and what they preserved. It suggests that their withdrawal, whatever its cause, was a withdrawal from the smaller and more immediate purposes only, rather than from purpose itself that had once occupied their attention. The Great Plan, in its widest and most consequential form, still commanded their devotion even when their own city's daily needs did not, a hierarchy of care that placed the stability of the whole world above the comfort of their own people. However strange or even troubling such a priority might seem, to those who live beneath a Slann too, withdrawn to notice their nearer struggles. The first uncertainty. Deep into this long age of quiet withdrawal, a catastrophe struck that no plague had ever foretold, and for the first time, the Slann faced a disaster their makers had left them entirely unprepared to understand. For all the long ages of the Great Plan's unfolding, the Slann had always possessed at least some fragment of guidance, some plaque or impression that hinted, however incompletely, at what the future held. This changed when the temple city of Chupayotl, standing as it had for ages beyond counting, sank without warning into the sea that surrounded it. Its Slann Mage-Priests lost beneath the waves, its people scattered or drowned in a catastrophe that came without any precedent the Slann could find in all their careful study of the Great Plan's instructions. What made Chupayotl's fall different from every disaster that had come before it, even the terrible losses of the war against chaos, was its utter absence from anything the Old Ones had left behind. The war, terrible as it was, had at least followed from a cause the Slann could trace and, in time, come to understand. The broken gates, the flooding power, the demon tide that followed. Chupayotl offered no such explanation. No plaque spoke of a city meant to sink beneath the waves. No impression prepared any Slann for a loss that arrived without warning and without any discernible place within the Great Plan's careful design. For a civilization built entirely upon the certainty that every hardship, however terrible, served some purpose within a design too vast to grasp in whole, this was a wound unlike any other. It was the first moment in all of Lizardman history when the Slann faced a catastrophe with no fragment of guidance to explain it, no assurance that the loss served some purpose their makers had foreseen. The response to this uncertainty revealed something the Great Plan had never had occasion to test before: how a people built entirely around inherited certainty might face a loss their inheritance had nothing to say about. Some Slann, by the accounts that survived, redoubled their study of the surviving plagues, searching with renewed urgency for some fragment they might have overlooked, some hidden reference to Chupayotl's fate buried in text, too damaged or too obscure to have yielded its meaning before. Others turned instead toward a harder acceptance, that not every loss the Great Plan's servants would face could be traced back to some grand design. That catastrophe might occur without cause, unheralded and unexplained, even within a world their makers had shaped with such evident care and purpose. This division marks one of the few moments in the whole of Lizardman history where the response to crisis was not uniform, where the same catastrophe produced two different answers among a people who had, until this point, moved with something close to a single shared understanding of what any given hardship demanded of them. Chupayotl's fall did not merely cost the Lizardmen a city and its Mage-Priests. It opened, for the first time, a genuine question about the limits of what the Great Plan could be trusted to explain, a question that would echo through every age of Lizardmen civilization still to come. What this first true uncertainty meant for a people who had never before been asked to face the unknown, without some thread of inherited instruction to hold on to, is the story we turn to next. Tomorrow, in the final part, we sit with the meaning of the Great Plan and what it means to serve a design whose planners can no longer be asked whether it still holds. Sleep well. Tomorrow, in the final part, we sit with the meaning of the Great Plan and what it means to serve a design whose planners can no longer be asked whether it still holds. We have followed the Lizardmen from their shaping in the earliest ages of the world to the long isolation that followed the war against chaos, from the certainty of a design inherited whole to the first uncertainty that ever touched their maker's careful instructions. Tonight, in this final part, we come to what it all means, a civilization that has served a plan for ages beyond counting, without its planners, without the promise of an end, and without ever once setting the labor down. Tonight we sit with the meaning of the Great Plan, and what it means to serve a design whose planners can no longer be asked whether it still holds. Tonight, in this final part, we sit with the meaning of the Great Plan, and what it means to serve a design whose planners can no longer be asked whether it still holds. Two answers held together. Since the fall of Chupayotl, the Lizardmen have carried two different responses to uncertainty within a single civilization, neither one ever displacing the other in whole. Recall the divide that opened when Chupayotl sank beneath the waves without warning or precedent. Some Slann turned toward renewed study, certain that some overlooked fragment must explain what had happened. Others turned toward a harder acceptance, that catastrophe might arrive without any place in the Great Plan's design at all. In the ages since, neither answer has won out over the other. Both persist, side by side, within the same temple cities, sometimes within the council of a single ruling Slann, weighing one instinct against the other, in the quiet of its own long contemplation. This unresolved duality might seem, to another race, a kind of weakness, a civilization unable to settle upon a single understanding of its own place in an uncertain world. But among the Lizardmen, it has become instead a kind of balance, one that lets them continue functioning even where certainty has failed them. Those who search the plaques still search, preserving the discipline and the devotion that has always marked the Slann's approach to their inheritance. Those who have made peace with unexplained loss still labor on regardless, proving that the Great Plan's service does not require an answer to every question it raises. Between them, the Lizardmen have found a way to hold both faith and doubt without either one undoing the other. There is a wisdom in this that a more rigid civilization might never have discovered. Had every Slann demanded certainty before continuing their labor, Chupayotl's unexplained fall might have shattered the whole of the Great Plan's authority, its servants paralyzed by a question their makers had left no answer for. Instead, the Lizardmen learned in the hardest way possible that devotion could survive the absence of explanation, that a plan worth serving did not need to justify itself at every turn to remain worth the serving. This balance between the two answers has, in the ages since Chupayotl, become something closer to a hidden strength than a lingering weakness. Where a civilization built on a single rigid certainty might shatter entirely the moment that certainty proved false, the Lizardmen have discovered, through hard necessity rather than any deliberate design, that a people can carry contradiction within themselves and continue functioning regardless. Some among them still search for answers. Some have made their peace with questions that may never be answered at all. And the Great Plan proceeds, tended by both in equal measure, neither the searching nor the acceptance ever displacing the other in whole. It is worth wondering whether the Old Ones, in whatever wisdom shaped the whole of their design, ever intended their servants to develop this capacity for holding two answers at once. Nothing in the surviving plaques suggests they foresaw a catastrophe like Chupayotl's fall, let alone the divided response it would provoke among the Slann who faced it. And yet, the capacity that emerged from this unforeseen crisis, the ability to serve a purpose without demanding it explain every hardship along the way, may prove to be just the resilience the great plan needs to survive whatever further uncertainties still lie ahead of it. What the plan asks of those who cannot finish it. No lizard man living today will ever see the great plan completed, and none before them ever did, and yet the labor continues, generation after generation, toward an end none of them will witness. Consider what it means to serve a purpose on this scale. A Slann spawned today inherits fragments of a design first set in motion, before the elves raised their first towers, before the dwarfs sank their first mine, in an age so distant that even the plaques recording it have grown worn and uncertain with time. That same Slann will spend the whole of its long existence laboring at some portion of that design, interpreting what plaques remain, tending what the geomantic web still allows, guiding whatever generation of skinks and saurus and croxigor serves alongside it. And when its existence ends, the great plan will remain just as unfinished as it was before that Slann was ever spawned, its completion no nearer for one more lifetime spent in its service. This is a strange kind of labor by the standards of races who measure their lives against goals they might reasonably expect to see fulfilled. A warrior of another race might fight for a victory within reach of a single lifetime. A builder might raise a monument whose completion they will live to witness. The lizardmen labor toward something else entirely, a design so vast that no single generation's effort could ever bring it to completion. Each Slann and each skink and each saurus contributing a fragment of a whole that will only ever be finished, if it is finished at all, by generations none of them will ever meet. And yet this labor is not despair, not the grim persistence of a people trapped in meaningless repetition. There is a dignity in work undertaken without the comfort of seeing its end, a devotion purer in its way than any labor performed in hope of a reward the laborer expects to claim. The lizardmen do not serve the great plan because they expect to witness its completion. They serve it because it is the purpose for which they were made, and because a purpose worth having does not require the one who holds it to see it through to its final hour. There is a comparison worth drawing here to the very stars, whose movement governs the spawning pools that give each new lizard man its form. The stars themselves complete their vast wheeling courses across spans of time no single observer could ever witness in whole, their light reaching the world long after the fires that made it have burned to nothing, their patterns unfolding according to a design older than any watching eye. The lizard men, shaped by the Old Ones to answer to this same slow celestial patience, seem to have inherited something of the stars' own indifference to any single moment of observation, content to play their part in a pattern whose full shape only reveals itself across a span of time no individual life could ever encompass. Bain, a different kind of faith, where other peoples of the world are driven by conquest, by fear, by the hunger for power or the comfort of gods who promise reward. The lizard men persist on something quieter, faith without the expectation of witness. Across the whole of the world the lizard men inhabit, other races pursue their ambitions with a very different shape. Some conquer for glory they hope to enjoy within their own lifetimes. Some pray to gods who promise paradise or reward to those faithful enough to earn it, a bargain struck with the expectation of eventual payment. Some seize what they can while they yet live, and nothing more, trusting nothing beyond the days allotted to them. The Lizardmen alone, among all the peoples of that world, labour toward a purpose that offers no such personal stake, no glory to be claimed, no paradise to be earned, no certainty even that the labour will ever reach completion at all. This makes their devotion something closer to pure faith than anything most other races practice, a faith in the simple worth of the task itself, rather than in promised reward. They do not know whether the Old Ones will return to judge how faithfully their design has been carried forward. They do not know whether the great plan can even be completed, given how much has already been lost to catastrophe and to ages of slow decay. They continue regardless, tending spawning pools and studying plaques and guarding a vortex not their own, because the alternative, to abandon a purpose merely because its completion cannot be guaranteed, has never once occurred to them as a reasonable answer to uncertainty. There is something the rest of the world might learn from this, if the rest of the world ever paused to consider it. Most purposes worth pursuing offer no guarantee of completion within a single life, and most of what any people build outlives the builders who raised it. The Lizardmen have made this truth the whole and explicit foundation of their existence, rather than a fact quietly set aside in favour of nearer and more immediately satisfying goals. They are, in this sense, among the most patient and the most honest of all the world's peoples, asking nothing of their purpose but the chance to serve it, and expecting nothing in return but the serving itself. It is worth remembering, too, that this faith was never tested in comfort. The Lizardmen did not arrive at their patient devotion through some untroubled age of certainty. They arrived at it through catastrophe, through the loss of their makers and the death of their oldest generation, through a war that nearly ended them and a city that sank without warning or explanation. Their faith, unlike so many faiths that promise their followers an easier road for their devotion, was forged in the very circumstances that might have broken it entirely. That it did not break, that it bent instead into something wiser and more resilient than the rigid certainty it replaced, may be the closest thing to a triumph the Lizardmen's whole long story ever offers. What endures? So we come to the end, and to what the Lizardmen have become across the whole of their long and patient story. A civilization still labouring at a design its makers never returned to complete, still faithful to a purpose that may never be finished. This has been the story of the Lizardmen, servants of the Old Ones and keepers of the Great Plan. From their shaping in the jungles of Lustria and the castes built for purposes fixed before birth, through the Slann, who carry their makers' fragmentary instructions, and the temple cities raised in precise service of a design beyond full understanding, through the Great Catastrophe that broke the gates and stole the Old Ones from the world, through the desperate war against the demon tide and the vortex raised by hands not their own, to the long isolation that followed, and the first uncertainty that ever touched their inherited certainty. Across every one of these ages, one thing never changed. The labour continued. Cities fell and were mourned and, where possible, rebuilt. Generations of Slann were spawned, laboured, and passed into whatever rest or continuation awaits their kind, each leaving the Great Plan just as unfinished as they found it. The stars still turn above Lustria, and the spawning pools still answer to their patient movement, shaping new servants for a design whose final shape no living creature has ever seen in whole. Whether the Old Ones will ever return, whether the Great Plan can ever really be completed, whether the whole vast labour serves any purpose beyond the serving itself, remains as unknown today as it was in the earliest ages after the makers vanished. And still, the Lizardmen continue, tending their cities, studying their plaques, watching their stars, faithful to a design they will never see finished, and to makers they will never see again. It is, perhaps, the quietest and most enduring devotion the world has ever known. A people who serve without witness, who labor without reward, who wait with patience and without complaint for a return that may never come. Perhaps this is the truest thing left to say of the Lizardmen, stranger than any single fact recorded across the whole of their long history, that a civilization built entirely from purpose, shaped down to its very flesh for a design not its own, discovered along the way something that looks, from the outside, remarkably like grace. They did not choose their purpose, and yet they have carried it with a steadiness few chosen purposes ever earn. They cannot know whether their labor will ever matter to anyone beyond themselves, and yet they labor on, patient as the stars whose slow turning still shapes every new generation drawn up from the ancient spawning pools of Lustria. And so, the great plan continues, unfinished and perhaps unfinishable, tended by a people who have made peace with never knowing whether their whole existence serves any end beyond the tending itself. Somewhere in the jungles of Lustria, a Slann sits motionless upon its floating throne, its mind bent toward calculations no outsider could follow, its city governed by skink priests who preserve traditions whose deepest meaning has grown hazy with the passing ages. The stars turn above them, as they have turned since before the first spawning pool was ever filled, and the Lizardmen wait, as they have always waited, for makers who may never return, faithful to the last to a plan whose planner is gone, told slowly, for the quiet between waking and whatever waits in the dark. Good night, my friend.